Britain expressed support for establishing a home for the Jewish people on that land. After World War II, more and more Jews migrated to the area. In 1947, the United Nations created a plan to partition the land into Jewish and Arab states. The Jews liked the plan, the Arabs did not. When the State of Israel was officially established in 1948, the surrounding Arab countries opposed it vehemently.
The Jews and the Palestinians both equally have perfectly legitimate claims to the land. Ultimately, the only solution for the both of them is that both of them end up in states of their own alongside each other.
Yaakov Luzowick is Israel's former chief archivist. He says the Jewish right to the land is rooted in history. The Jewish presence there dates back over 3,000 years. The Jewish people wrote their scriptures there. Jesus, who was a Jew, lived there. Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world, and both the Bible and even the Quran refer to the Jewish people's ties to the land.
There have been Jews in this land always, perhaps with the exception of a few years after the Crusaders conquered in 1099 and murdered all the Jews and then didn't let them back in. But other than that, there have been Jews here always.
The surrounding Arab countries aren't convinced by this history. Many in those countries argue that in more recent history, the land was populated mostly by Arabs, and that it's entirely their land. The conflicts continue to this day. Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Dealt with MS-13. This is the same type of organization. We have fought organized crime before, and we are not going to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, it's very important that they address this because this goes back to 1993 when the FBI wiretapped those Hamas activists in Philadelphia, and they found that they were trying to improve their discussions and basically operate in the shadows, saying things like, "I swear by Allah that war is deception." They wanted to inevitably become more prominent if the U.S. were to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization instead of having all of their organizations be shut down immediately. So what can Americans do to inform themselves and to pick up on any of this propaganda that they're seeing?
So the Muslim Brotherhood and all its offshoots, they follow a very strict code and narrative. So the way I personally identify them, because they have become, like you said, very sophisticated. The reason the FBI couldn't, or the CIA or the Mossad or any intelligence agency intercept the crimes that took place on October 7th is because they have become incredibly sophisticated in the way of counter surveillance. So this is, I have discussed extensively in my book how to be able to still discover them as law enforcement. As for the American people, their narrative is clear. Their narrative is bigoted. It's they agitate for division and for warfare. They are anti-Semitic and xenophobic, and they hate Christians just as much as they hate the Jewish people. There is a very clear narrative. They also adopt the grievance du jour. That's something that they picked from the Soviet Union. They have been trained by ex-Nazis, by the way, their leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's a fact, not an opinion. They've also been trained by Soviet propagandists. That's also a fact, not an opinion. So we should recognize their specific patterns in propaganda, and that's how we identify them. They're, of course, the useful idiots, but we will be able to clearly identify who's who from what they say.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this to light. Cynthia Farahat, the author of The Secret Apparatus, the Muslim Brotherhood's Industry of Death.
Hamas, a far more powerful terrorist group, watches from beyond the northern border.
Hezbollah is by far much more powerful than Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Its military capacities are, 10 times bigger than Hamas and Islamic Jihad together, combined.
Avi Melamed is a former Israeli senior official and the author of Inside the Middle East. He says it's possible Hezbollah could attack Israel and join the war, though it's far from certain. If Hezbollah were to attack, the result could be devastating. Hezbollah is estimated to have 150,000 rockets. Hamas's rockets are made from pipes. Hezbollah's rockets include heavy missiles, long-range missiles, and high-precision missiles. It also has assault drones, cyber warfare capabilities, trained combat forces, including special units, intelligence gathering capabilities, and an independent communication system. If Hezbollah joins the war,
this would inflict a very significant damage to the state of Israel. Missiles and rockets are deliberately targeting Israel's cities and infrastructure like harbors, airports, and so on. Israel will be able to intercept the rockets, or many of the rockets, but still the amount of rockets and missiles Hezbollah could launch are just simply enormous.
Melamed says Israel won't be able to stop all those rockets. Hezbollah was founded in the early 1980s with the main goal of resisting Israel. It has even fought with Israel before in a month-long war in 2006 that left over 1,000 Lebanese citizens dead. Since the recent Hamas terror attack, Israel has been exchanging gunfire with Hezbollah almost daily. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
And the U.S. has been quietly
have violated international law. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby addressed the talk of a ceasefire.
We're going to continue to make sure Israel has the tools and the capabilities that they need to defend themselves. And as I think you've heard us say, a ceasefire right now really only benefits Hamas.
Kirby also extended sympathies to the family of Omer Balva, an Israeli-American dual citizen from Rockville, Maryland. The IDF soldier was killed on Monday at Israel's northern border by anti-tank missile fire.
Certainly offer our deepest condolences to the family. That's news no mom and dad ever want to get. I don't have any communication to speak to one way or the other, but again, our thoughts and prayers go to the family.
Kirby also discussed Tuesday the possibility of evacuating Americans from the Middle East in case the Israel-Hamas war spreads into a broad regional conflict.
It would be imprudent and irresponsible if we didn't have folks thinking through a broad range of contingencies and possibilities. And certainly evacuations are one of those.
Kirby stressed there are currently no active efforts to evacuate Americans from the region beyond charter flights out of Israel. The National Security Council spokesman also said the U.S. is deeply concerned by the potential for future attacks on American troops. He estimated there had been around a dozen such attacks over the last several days. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Tuesday that 33 Americans have been confirmed dead after the Hamas terror attack on Israel on October 7th. 10 Americans are still missing. An unknown number of them are presumed to be held hostage in Gaza. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Israel is rejecting a UN call for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict.
And the Israeli foreign minister is calling for the resignation of the UN Secretary General over comments he made.
Israel's foreign minister Eli Cohen told the UN Security Council that the war is not just Israel's, but a war of the free world. Cohen said, quote, "How can you agree to a ceasefire with someone who swore to kill and destroy your own existence?"
Cohen also canceled a scheduled meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in protest over statements he made. Guterres said the Hamas attacks did not exist in a vacuum.
And next, we will conflict.
And the Israeli foreign minister is calling for the resignation of the UN Secretary General over comments he made.
Israel's foreign minister Eli Cohen told the UN Security Council that the war is not just Israel's, but a war of the free world. Cohen said, quote, "How can you agree to a ceasefire with someone who swore to kill and destroy your own existence?"
Cohen also canceled a scheduled meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in protest over statements he made. Guterres said that Hamas attacks did not exist in a vacuum. As Israel fights Hamas, another enemy sits near Israel's northern border watching the events. A terrorist group that boasts it's thousands of times stronger than before. If it enters the fight, the war will change completely. NTD's Arlene Richards has more.
Being determined by these wars in Europe and in the Mediterranean. However, they are being debilitated by the fact that the US government at the White House level is spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars and sending away readiness capabilities to fight these wars in Europe and the Mediterranean.
one more thing before we go. I just wanted to get this question and to clarify. So did you, when you say that China has a role to play in all of this and it was opportunistic, is it, would you be saying that they were complicit in the start of this war and the attacks? I know that you had a piece that you wrote that you say multiple governments were aware and complicit. Would China be one of them, and how actively, or how big was the role?
Well, we can't determine the full extent of it, but we know that this war was not accidental. It didn't start with any short-term planning. It had a lot of external help, a lot of external logistical support. Some of this came from Iran, some of it came from Turkey. It was done with the complete knowledge, absolutely, of the People's Republic of China and their intelligence services. The question is, did they fund it? Did they help plan it? Did they sponsor it? They certainly encouraged it, that's for sure.
I see. Thank you so much for your in-depth analysis as usual, Gregory Copley. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
China has removed its defense minister from office. According to Chinese state media, General Li Shangfu was replaced just 7 months after taking office.
Li has been out of public view for almost 2 months. No further information was given on his whereabouts or reasons for removal.
Li is the second senior Chinese official to disappear this year. Former Foreign Minister Qin Gang was removed from office in July, also with no explanation offered. Li became defense minister during a cabinet reshuffle in March. He has not been seen since giving a speech on August 29th. Li is currently under U.S. sanctions in relation to his overseeing weapon purchases from Russia and barred from entering the country.
There is no indication that the disappearances of Qin and Li signal a change in China's foreign or defense policies, but questions have been raised about the resilience of regime leader Xi Jinping's circle of power. As defense minister, Li mostly handled military diplomacy and didn't hold command responsibilities over combat operations. A replacement has not yet been named. Coming up, Representative Mike Johnson is the latest to make a play for the Speaker's chair. We have more on the candidate that House members will vote on later today.
The China-Mexican drug cartel precursor is the subject of a Senate caucus. What you need to know coming up.
Should the homeless have a right to a public place to sleep? An appeals court says so, but there's a legal battle against that ruling. We hear why from one of the attorneys involved.
We know what we're dealing with, that the person's who they really say they are. Unfortunately, right now, the mass migration, we're really relying only on automated records checks based on fingerprints and photographs. And that's one tool, but it really does not replace the interviews that need to take place. So that's what that bulletin is supposed to do, is really increase those interviews and that focus. Unfortunately, there's just not enough agents and officers to handle the mass migration and those interviews right now. So it's really, nothing's going to change.
Well, I mean, a lot of people might have questions about that because they hear, oh, they were sending the National Guard there. There's, of course, local forces there. That's not enough to handle the number of people coming across?
So going to cbp.gov this last year, under the Biden administration, there were over 3.2 million encounters with illegal aliens coming to the United States. That means Customs and Border Protection officers had to process 3.2 million people that didn't have immigration documents. It's above and beyond the legitimate trade and travel. On the southwest border alone, in between the ports of entry, it was over 2.1 million people. It takes an hour to process each one, just basic, without having an in-depth interview. I just talked to some people in San Diego this week. They've arrested people with 180 different countries, but over 200 different languages and various dialects. Border Patrol agents don't speak all that. Just think how much additional time it takes to process people that don't speak English or Spanish. No, there's not enough time to do all of this. The mass migration has really taken away meaningful investigative law enforcement capability along the border.
Well, and it would make sense, too, that I'd imagine some of these countries don't have the same records keeping that we would maybe expect. And so if all they're doing is checking existing records, I mean, what are the limits of that?
It's extremely limited, and people need to understand those are U.S. databases. So even the National Terrorist Watch List, the TSDS, that is a database that anybody across the border is bounced off of, if you will. But those are only the knowns. And beyond that, if they're research the NCIC, it's a National Criminal Information Center, but that means we're searching for crimes committed in the United States before. We have relatively zero, like no information on people from around the entire world. If they show up with no identification whatsoever, agents and officers literally have to take them on their word, what their name is, where they were born, and even their birth date, and then that becomes their new identity. The records checks do not meet the needs we have.
Well, I was going to ask about that because I've done investigations at the border. I've been on the Mexico side. One thing I found really shocking was if you go there, the ground is covered in passports, ID cards, plane tickets, bus tickets. Like, what I was told is people discard their identities before crossing over. I mean, what issues does that end up raising for people trying to process them?
You have to take them on their word, and just think about that for a minute. Let's just say a majority of the migrants, as a lot of people like to call them, asylum seekers, even though it's fraud. It's not really asylum seeking. Let's just assume that they're actually good people. Statistically, out of that 3.2 million people, there are a lot of bad actors that are willing to just make up a new identity and a new birth date, knowing that as long as they cross without documents, the minute that they lay their hands on a federal fingerprint scanner, whatever information they just gave that federal officer, that's now their new identity. It's basically like a fresh start. We don't have records checks from all these different countries around the world. Many of them don't have them anyway, but many countries would never share them with us. Venezuela, for example, they're not going to share their criminal databases with us. We just don't know. So when the secretary, people need to understand this, when the secretary says that these people are being vetted, their name and their biometrics and even their photographs sometimes are being bounced off of basically an empty database.
Wow.
There's nothing to check it against.
Well, I guess, given this new memo, then warning of a terror threat, I guess, about a minute left. What would your recommendations be?
So slow down the flow of illegal immigration across the border, because going back to 9/11, we learned then that really what it comes down to is the face-to-face interview. We have highly trained CBP officers and Border Patrol agents that know how to detect deception. They know how to do additional research to see if what the individual person is telling them is true. But right now, today, they don't have time to leverage those skills because of the massive amount of illegal immigration. All we need to do is slow it down so agents can do their job, and the security of this country will be dramatically increased.
Rodney, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Democrats are accused of wanting open borders in order to get more illegal immigrants who are then going to vote Democrat. The situation at the border also has been getting increasingly worse over the past few years under the Biden administration. Border Patrol agents have apprehended roughly 1,973,092 illegal immigrants along the southwestern border in the past 11 months, according to, that is, Custom and Border Protection data. All of this has now culminated in a battle between Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and a handful of major cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. These cities have declared themselves sanctuary cities for illegal immigrants, regardless of their legal status. The political leaders of these cities have been so open and generous in their message to illegal immigrants over the past few years. The most obvious example of this is Mayor Eric Adams of New York City. He campaigned on a promise of protecting illegal immigrants. This is what he wrote on X, formerly Twitter, back in 2021. He said, "We should protect our immigrants, period. Yes, New York City will remain a sanctuary city under an Adams administration." And here is what Adams wrote back in August of 2022.
I have to provide services for families that are here, and that's what we're going to do. And that's what our responsibility as a city. I'm proud that this is a right to shelter state, and we're going to continue to do that.
Now, however, his tone is not so welcoming. Not after months of Governor Abbott sending buses full of illegal immigrants to New York City, at least. You see, Governor Abbott, in March of 2021, enacted Operation Lone Star. The governor deployed troops from the Texas National Guard and the Texas Department of Public Safety to the southwestern border. increased funding for border security, designated Mexican drug cartels to an extent at least as foreign terrorist organizations, and started his busing program the following year. He has been busing immigrants, illegal ones, to these sanctuary cities ever since. Abbott put this program in place in response to the Biden administration's lack of action in response to the crisis going on at the border.
Texas is providing charter buses to send these illegal immigrants who have been dropped off by the Biden administration to Washington, D.C. We are sending them to the United States Capitol, where the Biden administration will be able to more immediately address the needs of the people that they are allowing to come across our border.
So how did these cities react to Governor Abbott's bus plan? Well, let's start with Eric Adams. He now says that the influx of immigrants will destroy New York City.
This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City.
You created it.
10,000 migrants a month. One time we were just getting Venezuela. Now we're getting Ecuador. Now we're getting Russian-speaking coming through Mexico. Now we're getting Western Africa. Now we're getting people from all over the globe have made their minds up that they're going to come through the southern part of the border and come into New York City. And everyone is saying it's New York City's problem. Every community in this city is going to be impacted. We had a $12 billion deficit that we're going to have to cut. Every service in this city is going to be impacted.
But wait, I thought we should protect and welcome every single immigrant. What has happened here is this. Mayor Adams has felt the actual consequences of illegal and unlimited immigration. Now, all the immigrants coming right now are in from Abbott's buses, not all of them. In fact, only about 18,500 are from Operation Lone Star. Remember, he said about 10,000 a month, and that's all of those. But these, paired with the open sanctuary city policy, well, they have put New York City in a tough position. And Adams is now feeling that. Since spring of 2022, more than 110,000 illegal immigrants have arrived in New York City saying they need some help. And the mayor's office says that approximately 10,000 asylum seekers are still arriving again in the city every single month. Mayor Adams is now realizing the city cannot afford to support all of these people because the majority of them have no authorization to legally work in this country. And New York City has stated that updated forecasts show that this crisis could cost the city more than $12 billion over the next 3 years. No wonder Adams is declaring a state of emergency. But what seems to be lost on him is the irony. His policies and other policies like it across the country talk a lot about being welcoming and open arms and all it would be racist to turn people away. They criticize Governor Abbott for not having an open border to his state. The second immigrants show up at their doors, well, it's a state of emergency. New York City isn't the only city where Abbott has sent buses to either. Los Angeles opened an investigation on Abbott in the state of Texas for kidnapping or human trafficking for sending a bus with illegal immigrants on it. And one city councilman for LA called Abbott racist, just for good measure too. Now, Chicago, on the city's website, calls itself the welcoming city. It says, we have a responsibility to provide access to shelter, food, and medical care to everyone, regardless of immigration status. How many immigrants came on Abbott's bus program before then Mayor Lori Lightfoot said that they had hit their limit? Well, only 8,000 people. And just as a reminder, over 1 million people crossed the Texas-Mexico border in the last 11 months. And those are only the ones that were apprehended. Washington, D.C. and Denver, they had similar reactions to receiving immigrants from Texas. Both also declared a state of emergency. It seems so clear that these cities want the image of being welcoming and open, but they don't want the actual consequences of that. They want Texas to bear the brunt of the open border policy. And also, well, if Texas is racist, if it doesn't do that, well, look, What is being illustrated here as well is that an open immigration policy is simply impossible to manage. Chicago showed that very clearly. 8,000 immigrants was enough to fill up their shelters, and it sapped all of their resources. It should make every single one of these sanctuary city mayors say, wow, maybe if a few thousand immigrants here is a problem, then, well, hey, maybe the millions at the border is also a really big problem. But it doesn't make them say that, because the important thing is to still have an open immigration policy. Democrats at every level have demonstrated that they want immigrants here, and they don't care if they come legally or not. The Biden administration shows this every day that it passes, and they do nothing about the crisis at the border. They appointed Vice President Kamala Harris as the border czar. And how many times has she visited the border? Well, once. And only after immense pressure from Republicans. Notice that none of the mayors are calling for Biden to close the southwestern border. They're just asking for federal money to support the immigrants that have arrived in their cities. They want everybody to pay for it. These mayors could do something to help their situation, maybe push the Biden administration to close the border. And until something is done at the actual source of the problem, well, the southern border, these issues are not going to go away. Learn the lesson that you are clearly being taught by Governor Abbott. The situation is untenable. And this is just one aspect of the border issue. After the break, we'll be going into more about Customs and Border Patrol and a memo warning that terrorists engaged in the Israel-Hamas conflict could soon be attempting to enter the United States through the southern border.